Hey, welcome everybody to the Salt Grain Podcast. I'm your host, Holly McNamara, and I'm here today with Joey Dumont, who lives in San Francisco area. And there's
I
a
live
lot.
in San Francisco.
Yeah, okay, right in the city. So, yeah, we have a lot to talk about. Joey and we were connected in one particular way, but then we have other things in common and connections that we learned as we got to know each other. And I'm going to kind of give a quick overview. I'm going to explain how we met, and we can kind of go back and forth. And then I kind of want you to explain for the listeners a brief summary of your background and what you're doing today. And, I really want to get into your podcast and talk
Sure.
about how, we talked a lot on your podcast. We talked about Tony Hsieh. And people are probably wondering, well, how does that tie into politics and being a public figure? Well, it definitely does, and we're going to kind of get to that. And Joey's doing a lot of deep dives and a lot of politically related topics, and had some really major interviews, some really great interviews for some folks. So in 2012, I was living in San Francisco. I just moved from Las Vegas, living with Tony Hsieh. We finished the book tour for his CEO, or for his Delivering Happiness book. And the book launch was done, the tour was done, everything was kind of wrapped up. And I decided that I didn't want to stay in Vegas. I moved to San Francisco, worked for a startup. I was only in San Francisco for a year. And towards the end of that year, a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, David Pritchard, who is hilarious,
Yeah.
sent us both an email and said something like, "I need to connect you two, and don't make fun of my ass gas."
Sounds like David.
Yeah. He was one of the producers, I think, of South Park and
Family Guy.
Family Guy. Yep. And something about Mary, the movie. So anyway, Joey and I met there at his office. And Joey is in marketing. So we met in San Francisco at his office, gave me a tour. And then we learned that we're both connected to Tony Hsieh. And that was not why we were first introduced. I don't think David had that in mind, but he could have. But either way, we learned, we both live here, and we both were connected to Tony Hsieh in very different ways. And so, here we are 11, 12 years later, after Tony's passing, learning a lot about Tony through his passing that a lot of people didn't know, but learning a lot from Tony even after his passing, as far as like working with people and being in the public eye, and then that all relates to being in politics. And so Joey and I, we've kept in touch over the years, and he's seen my political craziness and, everything that I've been through. And I've watched his podcast unfold, and it's incredible. So I want you to talk about your background and the podcast.
Sure. Yeah. When we met, David introduced us. I was a partner at an agency called Questus, and we were a digital marketing agency. And that was basically my career for 20 plus years. And when David and I introduced you, we were, like you said, we worked with Tony Hsieh. We shot a documentary called The Naked Brand, and we launched that in 2012. And part of our thesis was that social media, the supercomputers that we actually hold in our purses and our pockets, are going to change how brand communication works, specifically to their subscriber base and their customers.
And you were right.
Because, yeah, we thought that was cool. And so we interviewed a bunch of icons that we thought were changing the game. And Tony Hsieh was one of those because of what he was doing with Zappos, obviously. And he did some really cool things. And we interviewed him about all of the culture, specifically kind of the land for misfit toys. When we went to the lobby, there was this beautiful placard. It was like a yield or stop sign, and it had a man hugging a head. And it was basically just, hey, wherever you come from, when you get here, you will be hugged and loved and taken care of. And that was really what we thought was unique about Tony. Obviously he was a very smart entrepreneur, had mad success even before Zappos. And once he got there, his big thing was about making people feel comfortable with themselves and being part of something bigger. And I think that was what we wanted to celebrate with Zappos. And so we took our camera crew in there and we interviewed everyone we could get our hands on, including, what was the young man's name who sang, I can't remember the name of the song anymore. Was it Kevin? I don't know if it was Kevin.
I don't know.
He was the guy who actually, he ran the company, he ran the brand at the end. And I can't remember his name. But we interviewed him because he actually he applied for the job by singing a song about the 10.
Oh, Tyler.
Tyler, thank you.
Yeah.
And so we interviewed Tyler, and we interviewed the mayor of Hugs, and we interviewed a bunch of really cool kids that specifically talked to the customer service aspect of the business. So they didn't really have a lot of money earmarked for advertising back then. They did a lot of, in the airports, if you remember, they had the Zappos trays that they went
When
through.
I saw that tray when I was flying to Vegas for work, and I happened to see Tony every time I went, but the first time those were rolled out, I was at the airport and I was like, no fucking way.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Very unique. Yeah, it was typical of Tony. And the idea was that we had a customer service person that we interviewed who had the longest call, I think it was 12 hours.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, with customer service, your goal with call centers is to get on and off the phone as fast as possible because it's very expensive. Tony took the opposite approach. He's like, let's build a family. Let's make customer service our number one priority. And he did. And then he built $1 billion empire based on that. And then the reason I had you on my political podcast was because I really remembered how much I liked my time with Tony, the interviews that we had with him. He actually took us to his theater that he bought in downtown Las Vegas, and he showed our documentary. Yeah, to about 650 of his employees. And I remember standing next to him on the stage as he introduced us and what we were doing there. And he was genuinely and visibly nervous. He was not an extrovert. He was not someone who liked to be the center of attention. Spotlight was not his friend. And yet
till the day he died. Yep.
He was not an extrovert. And I think that was something that was lost from anybody that didn't know him. Obviously, you were a very close friend of his and you knew he was an introvert. And then, so when I brought you to the show, I wanted to talk specifically about his book, Wonder Boy, because it was such a well-written book. It was well-researched by some journalists that I have a lot of respect for. And when I brought you on the show, it was really to talk about, him and you and I and our connection there. And as we talked about, it didn't have a lot to do with politics, but I think everything in this culture today is political. And I think that that's really where you and I kind of connected again after many years of not seeing each other. And that was kind of our thing. And then, as you mentioned, I left the ad industry in 2018 to take a couple years off to write a memoir for my little boys. I have 2 little boys, currently 10 and 12. And the book was called Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag. And it was about my insecurity growing up with the sociopath father and some of the bad stuff that happened to us as kids, and then kind of how I came out of that malaise. And I wrote it for my little dudes because they fortunately have grown up in a really quiet home with parents that love each other and a very doting uncle and grandparents that adore them. And they have a really cool social network of friends and family here in San Francisco. And after I was going to do the book for a couple years and then go back to corporate America, and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And so it was staying with my little boys at the time, I think were 7 and 5 or 8 and 6, something like that. And so they were home. And for those who follow the news, specifically to COVID, San Francisco's school system was shut down for 18 months. Yeah. So we had our little boys here in the house with us every single day. And my wife is a senior level executive in the advertising world. And so she was very busy and I was not. So I took it upon myself to write 4 or 5 hours a day while taking my boys out for recess and cooking them grilled cheese sandwiches and having as much fun as we could for that couple of years. And then as I started to get back into the world of business, I decided to launch a political podcast called True 30. And that was launched in 2022 the summer of 2021. And to your point, I started interviewing folks in academia. I started interviewing political wonks and politicians and journalists and people that were kind of in the zeitgeist specific to politics. And as I think I just mentioned to you off camera, one of my last guests was a guy named Tom Shanker, who was a former war correspondent for the New York Times for 13 years, previous bureau chief in Moscow during the Soviet Union breakup. And we talked about his new book called Age of Danger that he co-wrote with a man named Andrew Hone. Both of these guys have credentials that are off the charts. Andrew was the former Secretary Deputy of Defense for the Bush administration. And so they wrote this book to kind of warn us, the public, about what's going on, specific, not to the two hot wars we have going on in Israel and Ukraine, because the book actually was published before the attacks, the Hamas attacks on Israel. Okay. But the idea was warning us against, or educating us on the warning and action systems of our federal government, specific to our Department of Homeland Security. And it was just a really cool interview and typical of what we were trying to get going with True 30. And over the last 2 years, and you and I talked about this off camera as well, we actually decided to dive into topics like gender identity, race, DEI, harm reduction policy specific to progressives in blue cities like my own. And, everything that, I think basically everything that causes the most drama possible between let's just say the divide of our blue and red teams.
So you dove right in.
Yeah. And it was tough because I was not used to that level of confrontation, being called a racist and a transphobe and an overall bad person. And
you have been called that?
Oh yeah, many times, because we did about 300 hours of reporting on defund the police as one example. And when you push back on the defund the police, you get pushback from certain folks that think you are going against them.
The liberal agenda. Yep.
Yeah. And so it was one of those things where I was like, as an ad guy, I was irritated by the slogan because it just didn't make any sense.
Right.
And what they really needed to do, and what we found out through all of our reporting, was that it was a reimagining of policing that needs to take place. And, if you look at, and this is a discussion that's still in the zeitgeist today, I'm a big fan of The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast. It's a morning podcast, about a half hour, and they interview one of their journalists about a story. And they interviewed one of their journalists this morning about cameras, body cameras that go on police. Yep. And it was, it was a decent report, but, consider I did so much homework on it, he missed a lot of major things. And what they talked about during this interview was how body cameras themselves are not a salvo to transparency, because, and this is part of my own reporting as well, is that the police departments, as a rule, still own the access to the recordings. So if they don't want to release them, they can just say, well, we're not going to release it. It's under investigation, so we're not going to release the
That's happening footage. To a friend of mine right now. He's trying to get access to the body cams.
And they'll get them. But it takes a long time, and it takes a reporter to go after public records and continue to bug them. Chicago is the only police department, and this is one of the featured stories this morning in the Daily, because they do have a kind of a citizens bureau that has access to the software. So when the footage comes in, they have access to it. So if there's something that's going to be hidden, then they will have the full footage of the police and the use of force and the things that took place on that. But I mentioned that in the sense that every topic that we dove into politically was cantankerous, and we offended the 8% minoritarian base on the left every article we wrote, and then we offended the 8% minoritarian base on the right with every article. And what we found over a period of a couple of years was that there was a growing group of people. I have about 15% of our audience is in Britain, and they like the fact that we produce the whole story. Yeah. So if we come in and we talk about defund, we're like, hey, there's some really cool police initiatives that are going on, and there's some stuff that is yet to be remedied, and it's still problematic, and specifically with large departments. What they didn't mention in the call this morning, is because it's a 25-minute interview, was that 80% of police departments in the United States are less than 25 officers. And that's something that people don't really understand. Yeah. So when you look at, big police departments, like the biggest in the country is New York City, obviously Chicago, Texas, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, San Francisco. I interviewed beat cops here in the city. I interviewed beat cops in Northern California. Santa Rosa Police Department has a 250 person force and a great reputation. California as a whole has a pretty good reputation specific to its training and its use of force statistics. But most of the departments are small. And because they're small, they don't even have body cameras, because body cameras come with it a really big price tag.
Expensive,
not only for the hardware, but for the retention and all the repository data. Where does it sit? How do they actually manage it? How do they keep it up? How do they, there's a lot of questions that dive into that. bigger than that is the training as it relates to de-escalation and understanding how to deal with domestic violence, which is the scariest thing that our police force has to deal with on a daily basis. They like traffic tickets. They like drunk and disorderlies. They like those kind of things because they're much easier. Domestic violence gets a name for it because it really is domestic violence. It's really scary. And so, the neat thing about what we were doing at True 30 was trying to dive into these topics and explore them with a holistic approach. And we called it slow journalism because a lot of these stories took months for us to actually, to go through and come out of. But it was a great 2-year period. And I think I shared with you off camera. I can't share what we're doing now, but I'm actually working now with a new business partner to launch the next iteration of this with True Investigative Journalists and an editor-in-chief. And we're taking it to the next step, which we're all very excited about. We're hoping to have that launched by May of 2024.
It's so exciting. Because, and you and I have talked about this before, but when I first wanted to get involved, I had never been involved in politics and never even paid attention to it. And so when I wanted to help my community and run for office, people told me, like, you really need to run. This is what you need to do in order to do what you're trying to do, which is help the community in X, Y, and Z ways. And it's nonpartisan at the local level, but I still didn't affiliate myself with either party. I had strange questions, like if I believed in abortion when I was campaigning, and I'm like, I have nothing to do with that, but when I was in office, as you know, it was very, there was a lot of controversy and people on both sides, not even related to the party system, but just fighting and infighting and just people just couldn't come to an agreement. And what I really like about what you're doing is like you just said, you're seeing both sides, you're telling the whole story, and that's hard to do. We don't have a lot of that today. And, the major networks, they can attempt to do it, but they have time limitations. They have, a structure that they have to say certain things. They can't say other things. And I just applaud you for doing this because it's so necessary.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. No, I think that's the real issue is that if you look at journalism in general, and you know this from your background in the business world, is it's not a good business. So investigative journalism is very expensive. There's the old issue called the Baghdad bureau problem, and that's, do you have a bureau in Baghdad because you need one, but it's really expensive. And so you have people and processes and lawyers and researchers and fact checkers and administrators and people of that. And then you have the journalists, and then you have everything to do with running an actual organization. And so if you look at the history, specifically recent history, with a lot of these companies, Vice News filed bankruptcy, BuzzFeed News filed bankruptcy, Intercept is in trouble. There was a really big launch of a company called The Messenger that was about, I think it was $40 or $50 million in funding. And this was in May of 2023, and they're now running out of money already.
God.
Yeah. So, from the article I read in the New York Times, they had $8 million in leases in Miami and New York City and DC. And so they went big. But the problem was these business models don't work, specifically if you're going to go after traffic. And Ben Smith, who is the founder of Semaphore, which is a brand new media organization funded with approximately 25 million, I think, if my numbers are correct. And Ben was the former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed and just a rock star journalist, just an amazing, smart guy, a great writer, prolific writer. But he is trying to reinvent the model as well. And then there's a lot of other companies. Jake Sherman runs something called Punchbowl News. Puck is a new organization that's doing a really good job of trying to build a new model. And 404 and Detractor, a couple of these companies are trying to reinvent the business model. And if you listen to any of these topics specific to podcasts today, there's a young man. Well, there's a lot of people out there talking about it, but the one thing they're trying to get across to everybody is that the business model itself has to change. And that's in part what we're trying to do as well, because the overhead has to be considerably smaller. And you can't have these, just warehouses of full-time employees and journalists and researchers and administrators and everyone that I mentioned. It's a very expensive piece.
And even office space. You don't need the office space.
You really don't. And it's also, if you look at the idea behind running any business, is if you can keep your FTEs down, it's to your benefit. And then what is it? How do you make money? And then the traditional ad revenue models of these businesses, they're all based on CPMs, which you understand. which is a cost per thousand on an ad buy. And so if you have 30 million uniques like BuzzFeed used to have on a monthly basis, you got a certain amount of money based on advertising, because this is how many ads are placed on your site. This is how many people pay for those ads. The problem was algorithms change. Google changes those algorithms. CPMs drop. So if you had a $25 or a $50 CPM and then it goes to $5, your business model has changed drastically, which means you don't have enough money to pay your employees. And that's kind of what took place with a lot of these journalistic business models, is they just didn't have enough revenue.
Constantly adapting.
Well, not only constantly adapting, they're chasing the audience. And that's where it gets really dangerous, specific to true whole story journalism, is that if you want to tell a story that's going to irritate your audience, you might lose subscribers, right? So if you're at the New York Times and you write a really scathing article about BLM, as one example, you will lose your following. And if you're a journalist who actually has been told by your organization, because this is part of public record, there was a memo that went out in 2014 from the New York Times that encourages its journalists to have a social graph, a social following on TikTok and Twitter and all of this, the likes, because it does bring audience to each article. The problem is, if you write an article about BLM and it was critical, and in some cases it needed to be, you could lose your audience. And you would, as a journalist, you could lose your own individual audience, and you could possibly lose your job, depending on what your editor thought of your piece. And so that's happening. The New York Times is doing very well, but the Washington Post is not. They lost $100 million this year. Jeez. And obviously Jeff Bezos can afford to do that. But the LA Times just laid off 115 employees. Last week, they closed their DC bureau. And this is during an election year. So that tells you that they're really hurting, right?
Yeah, because they have tons of news to report on.
Well, they do. And Time Magazine is laying people off. So if you look at the business models themselves, it's not good out there. And that's kind of the one funny thing, too. When we started this business, my friends are like, why are you starting a business in the worst business in the world? And it's like, it's a great question, but we think we can redo it specific to the cost infrastructure, number one. And then we also realize that there's certain stories that are just not compelling enough for people to log in and or pay and or subscribe to your platform. Here in California, we have water issues, but do I really want to have a reporter go to the Hetch Hetchy water division and figure out what's going on there, or sit through an actual, local meeting about our water system? It's relevant to all this, the people here that live in San Francisco, but is it a piece that we want to publish on our platform that we think people are going to like? No is the answer. Should we? There's a great piece that we're working on right now about California community colleges specific to DEI. And there's a lawsuit by FIRE, which is Greg Lukianoff's organization. I don't know if you've heard of FIRE, but it's the Foundation of Independent, Individual Rights and Expression, is what FIRE stands for. And Greg Lukianoff is a First Amendment attorney who his whole job is to go out and fight these kind of things. And there's a big lawsuit now against the California community colleges for mandating DEI training in the sciences and mathematics departments. And they don't know, these professors are pushing back. They're like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how to do this in science. I don't know how to introduce this ideology. And so that's kind of the meat of the lawsuit. And the reason I mention that is because I have had numerous guests on my program over the last year in support of DEI. I've interviewed Black scholars and academics and the importance of DEI and some of the good. There's a lot of good, by the way, with any diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, I should probably said that. That's what DEI stands for. Yeah. And the narrative out there today, if you start to look at what's going on, is that it's all negative. And it's kind of like everything in our body politic today. It's usually not one or the other. It's usually somewhere in the middle. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's happening. And so those are the kind of stories we think that will be interesting to our readers. And obviously, this is kind of piggybacking on the recent disastrous congressional hearings of the three presidents of Harvard, UPenn, and MIT.
I was just going to ask. Yeah.
So, Claudine Gay, who was a very controversial figure in all of this, is the president of Harvard. Mm-hmm. And she had a very difficult time defending what was going on with some of the calls for intifadas on Harvard's campus. And Elise Stefanik, who was a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress, asked her very poignant questions about why is Harvard allowing calls for genocide on their campus. And Claudine Gay's response was something very legal. It was, well, the content itself did not rise to any specific violence on our campus. And if it did, then we would actually investigate these claims, which was not a real bad answer in the legalistic sense, but it was a really bad answer considering that Harvard
Optics.
Harvard has removed, conservative speakers.
Yeah.
Because they were considered dangerous and or unsafe for their students. And so if you're going to remove people like that from your campus, that's against academic freedom and that's against free speech in the general. So that you can't have that as your defense in front of a congressional hearing, right? So that story blew up. Everyone on the left thought it was a racist attack on Claudine because she's a black female.
Black. Yep.
And they didn't like the people who came after her, which in this case was, there's a scholar from the Manhattan Institute who is a huge, I guess he disagrees with DEI. His name is Christopher Rufo. And he is a very bright, highly educated, and well-researched foe of DEI. And he and another reporter named Christopher Burnett actually surfaced, I think it was 40 or 50 different examples of plagiarism from Claudine Gay.
What?
And they were true. Yeah. And so what Claudine actually had to defend was that she said that she just didn't use the proper citations and that she changed those as fast as she could. But, it all came out. It all came out in the story and she was forced to resign. And so, those are the kind of things that we believe, in our organization, that we want to report on those things. Because is Claudine Gay a bad person? No. She seems to be a very wonderful human being who, once gotten to this specific place in her life, didn't have the words to defend herself based on an ideology that she touts constantly, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion side of things. And the ideology actually ended up biting her specifically. And the same thing with the University of Pennsylvania president who was forced to resign because there was a very big Jewish donor at UPenn who said if she doesn't resign or if she isn't fired, he will withhold his $100 million donation. So
come
obviously, yeah, no, this is the kind of stuff where as a reporter, it is mouth-watering, right?
Yeah.
You want to know.
Well, and there's so many layers to it. There are a lot of layers to it and to delve into and to really figure it out. Because even I've only watched some of that on the surface level. There are other things I'm paying more attention to, but I've wanted to know more about it. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah. And those are the kind of stories I think that we're going to have to, deal with. If you look at the Israel-Hamas conflict and how much sadness is taking place there, it's the same kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult for a August publisher like the New York Times or the Washington Post to report one way or the other because they get hammered.
Yeah, no matter what.
Doesn't matter where you are.
Right.
And that's the thing too for us is that if we did a big story on DEI or BLM or defund the police or gender ideology, whatever it may be, we are completely agnostic to the outcome.
Right.
And it may actually, as a Democrat, I would actually come out and say, oh man, that was a terrible story on Gavin Newsom. If we actually did one and we found out that we didn't like it. And for those who don't know, Gavin Newsom is our governor. And during COVID, one of the stories that was terrible, he went to this very expensive hoity-toity place in Napa and had this ridiculously expensive dinner and didn't wear his mask. And it was called French Laundry, which is one of the most expensive and wonderful Michelin star restaurants in the United States. And he got hammered for that, right? And I use that as an example because if we were reporting on that case, I would have enjoyed celebrating the reporter's homework and the story. But as a Democrat, I've been like, oh man, he got beat up.
Yeah, come on, Gavin.
But you got to do that. And I think that's another thing too, is that I've had people from my own party, DM me or send me notes to say, how can you do this? You're hurting our party. And it's like, well,
it's what happened.
That's what happened. Exactly. I'm like, well, that's what happened. So I'm not trying to report on, if I want to report on what I want to report, that's not reporting.
Yeah.
Right. That's storytelling.
And you're talking into an echo chamber.
Yeah. And that's another big problem is that, can you make a living offending your members? And that's something we have to figure out too, right? Because we're going to offend people. I've had a lot of people unsubscribe. We think there's about a 10% churn every month, specific to the stories we decide to report on. And once you actually see those go out, you get the comments back pretty quickly. Specifically with gender, I sat on a panel in June as a reporter on this. And when I talked to trans women competing in sports against natal females, I got hammered. I mean, just hammered because I disagree with it.
Yep. I do too.
Disagree with trans women competing just because the biology itself is.
I agree.
Is predominant, and it's something you can't argue against.
Right.
If you look at it from a nonpartisan lens, there's Leah Thomas is still fighting. She wants to compete in the Olympics this year, and Leah Thomas, as an example, said that she is now equal to women because she's been on estrogen for 3 years. And for those of you who don't know who Leah Thomas is, she was a former swimmer at UPenn. She's about 6'2". I'm not sure what her weight is anymore because she's lost some weight after she'd transitioned. But physically a very strong female.
Just built differently.
Trans woman now.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of where it got into. If you look at people, I always say, well, do you have a problem with the pronouns? Do you have a problem recognizing them? And it's like, no, I actually have compassion for them. During our time at True 30, I interviewed 20 trans women. I interviewed 10 trans men. I interviewed endocrinologists, pediatricians, journalists, specifically feminist journalists from the UK and Ireland and Scandinavia countries. And this was a huge discussion. I spent probably 6 months reporting on this.
This is incredible, Joey.
Yeah. And the neat thing about it was that, I came away from it having total compassion for anyone who is transitioning, because that's got to be just harrowing on every front.
Absolutely.
But the questions are, and this is what was taught to me by the feminist movement specifically, was, hey, we've been fighting for women's rights for 40 years. And part of that is being destroyed by trans women wanting to have access to female-only spaces, which is something I didn't even know existed.
Oh, I didn't even think
female-only spaces are female prisons, rape centers, and sports. Those are 3 very powerful examples. So if you're a trans woman and you commit a crime and you get put in prison and you identify as a female, then you then go to a female prison, and you can still have male genitalia as a self-identified trans woman. And that is where feminists are pushing back hard, as I would, by the way. And rape centers are the same thing. Yeah. So what I found out through the women that I was interviewing is that rape centers have historically been very cautious not to even have men in the building afterward. So if it's in an office building at 7 o'clock at night, they don't necessarily want a janitor who's male, who has a baritone voice or a beard or anything that triggers the women that come in for these very delicate counseling sessions. And so when trans women decided that they wanted to be part of this, that offended a lot of women, specifically in the feminist movement, about this situation. And then there's the female sports.
Yeah. So well, then there's male sports too, which is a whole other.
Well, I've always said this, and I mean this not to be flippant, but any trans man, so a biological woman who is transitioning to a man, wants to compete in male sports, knock yourself out.
Yeah, go ahead.
All good.
Yeah.
Like, no one's going to complain.
I totally agree.
Ever.
Yeah.
It's just never going to happen. We don't care.
Yeah.
So it's fine. I fought in martial arts for many years, and we, as a group, did not fight against females unless we were sparring and having fun, and we just kind of went at whatever level was appropriate for the sparring. But you didn't have men and women fight each other on purpose.
You can't.
And there's a reason for that. And this is where, again, this is the cool thing about reporting, is that it's facts versus opinions. And so, and these numbers kind of gel, but males on average have 30 to 50% more muscle mass in their lower body than biological females. 50 to 60% more muscle mass in their upper body, 120% more punching power, bigger hands, bigger feet, bigger heart, bigger lungs, more bone density, more fat, twitch muscle. We are physically superior on average to natal females. It's not something that should offend people.
No, it's just what it is.
It's actually true. And when I say these things
Yeah.
out loud, citations, please. I'm like, well, what I just mentioned comes from Dr. Carol Hooven, who's an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and she published this all in a book called T. And the T is and then I think the subheader is something like the hormone that divides and conquers us. And it's, it's really about the difference between biological males and biological females. And those are the kind of things that when I was doing my reporting, we got unsubscribed, you're a transphobe, you're a bad person, you're a racist. And that, for me, I thought I had pretty thick skin, but I actually like to be liked.
Yeah.
So it was one of those things where I was like, oh, this is brutal. And my wife hated it. And she told me to take down all the pictures of our children that I had on Facebook at some point. Well, yeah, it's because you actually do get threats.
Yeah.
And you get people that say, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to do this, and how dare you. And I think that's the weird things about our politics today is that, in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was our president, Tip O'Neill was our chief, was our speaker, they had dinner together.
Yeah.
Right. They smoked cigars. I don't know if Ronnie smoked cigars, but they had their cocktails and they had their steaks and they talked. And Ronnie was probably like, hey, Tip, I know you need to pass this bill, and I'll give you my agreement, but I need you to help me with this.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. President, I'll help you with this. And we've lost that today.
We've absolutely lost that.
I think a part of what we're trying to do, and this really sounds Pollyanna, but I think as we start to move forward with our reporting, it should bring people closer together in the sense that it's just reporting. So you can get mad, but it's just what we came up with, right?
It's information. Yeah. You're the messenger.
Yeah. If you want to look at, we did a lot of stuff on harm reduction policies, and I interviewed street nurses and clinicians and academics, and I live in San Francisco. So when people tell me that harm reduction policies are working, I'm like, well, no, they're not. And they're not working in Portland, and they're not working in Seattle, and they're not working in LA.
See, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, it's just, if you look at, like, in LA, they have, something called Skid Row, which is analogous to here in San Francisco. We have something called the Tenderloin, and these are just very blighted areas of the city geography-wise, and they are where we normally house our homeless and our addicted populations, and it's really sad. Right?
Yeah, it is.
Across the board. And the same thing stands true in Portland and Seattle. And they have, because of our progressive policies, we believe that these folks are victims, and we need to treat them as such, which means we need to treat them with respect and dignity and all of that. One of those tenets that comes from that is that it's the powers that be in harm reduction believe that it is a inhumane thing to force therapy on an addict. And I can tell you from personal experience, my little brother was an addict, and we lost him to his depression and his drugs in 2008. And so I went in and out of rehab centers with them. I've pulled him off the street. I've paid off drug dealers. I've been intimately involved with harm reduction policies for about 30 years of my life. And I can tell you through my reporting and through my personal experience with my little brother, harm reduction policies do not work. And it's not because parts of it don't work. We have two really cool case studies globally, Portugal and Amsterdam, where, I don't know if you know, these are called open drug markets. So if you have people out there doing drugs, it's decriminalized. So you can just do drugs in front of the cops. They don't really do much. They're not asked to do much.
Okay.
And it's really difficult to be prosecuted for doing drugs publicly. And that was one of the problems that Amsterdam and Portugal did a very good job of remedying. And they did it because it was a very holistic approach. They had the judges involved. They had the police departments. They had business owners. They had the citizens. They had the actual addicts themselves. They had street nurses, paramedics. They got everybody together and said, hey, we're going to go out and clean up this drug market, meaning that the police went through nicely and issued citations, said, hey, you can't congregate here anymore in groups of more than 5 because we know that if you're all together, you're going to be doing drugs.
Yeah.
Here's a citation. If you do it again, you have to appear in court. Great. Once they got him to court, they said, hey, here's your choice. You're an addict, so you can either go to a year of therapy or you can go to jail.
Okay. Yeah.
Here's
And
your
that,
choice, right?
yeah.
That's this. And if you've ever been around an addict, sadly, as I have, you know that they're addled. They're not thinking clearly. They don't know how to make a good decision for themselves until they're
Right.
at least 30 days clean. So it's not inhumane, in my opinion, to force or mandate therapy because it is the only thing that will save them. And or jail, which is the other decision. We all know this collectively, is that our jails and our prisons are broken.
Yep.
And if you put someone in there, they come out more broken than when you put them in. So
Yeah.
is it a good thing to put someone in jail for a year based on drug addiction? No. But is it a good thing to leave them on the street and have them OD and or die of disease or dysentery or any other disease that you can possibly by living on the street? Those are the kind of things that we actually ran into as reporters over the last year and a half, or 2 years now, that were daunting and difficult for us to report on. And then, as I mentioned, the fact that you get criticized from both sides on every story, makes it very difficult to do your job because you just try not to read too much, and I don't anymore. I mean, I don't go
you can't
ever. No.
It's like reading
and I know
tabloids.
You went through this.
Yeah,
I know you went through this too. It's just you can't believe it. Because you want to believe the good stuff, but if you want to believe the good stuff, you have to believe the bad stuff too.
Yeah, it's really hard though. And people say, "Oh, don't read it," but it's much easier said than done. And you're like, "Oh, I'm getting engagement," and then you're like, "Oh crap, it's bad engagement," and I don't want to hear these things. And then, oh, there's like one or two good comments, but the rest are bad, and it ruins your day, and then it will ruin my day. And so, but it took me a good 6 years to really understand that I'm okay, like that I don't need to read the comments and I don't want people sending me screenshots and I don't want to know. And to your point, way back at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned social media at the beginning in 2012, your company, said social media is going to change everything. And it did. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly what you're talking about right now. I think reporting has become harder because of social media, because social media, there's no hierarchy. It's flat. And everyone's voice is just as loud as the next person. And you don't really know who's right, who's wrong, what's fake, what's not. And even in such a small scale in my small town, it's so hard to inform people. And everything that you just explained, like, yes, you're being attacked, but these people need to understand, look at how much research you've done. And just remove the lens and remove your bias. I'm talking about them. Remove the bias and listen to the information. And it's nothing emotional. It's just you're just providing information. Yes, you're a Democrat, but you don't have this. It's not this confirmation bias. You're not reporting based on your party. And
I mean, there's no such thing as an activist professor, and there's no such thing as an activist journalist. You're either a professor or a journalist. You can't be both. And that's a big problem that we have on campuses today, and that's the big problem we have with journalists today, is that you want to be on your side. And there really is no side. If you're a Democrat, that's cool, but that doesn't mean you can't push back on narratives that go against the ideology of your party.
Yeah.
So BLM being one of those examples, harm reduction being one of those examples, defund the police being one of those examples, and gender ideology. So like every single topic that we reported on was polarized, and we were criticized by both sides. And that, again, is where I think journalism has an uphill battle. But if they do it correctly, they will eventually win their trust back. The problem is if you report on something and you find out that it was biased, then no one wants to believe your paper anymore. And that's a big problem.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the industry adage was, the trust grows at the speed of a coconut tree and falls at the speed of a coconut. So that was one of those things in advertising we used to tell our clients, like, hey, we have to make sure that what we put out there as far as your brand, your mission, your values align with you. Yeah. And you stay true to those values, because as soon as you don't, your brand goes sideways. And it takes 5 years to build a really good brand. Yeah. And I think the same thing with journalists. I'm a fan of the New York Times, specifically their reporting. Their op-eds are very left-leaning, however. So it's one of those things where, for me, as a Democrat, I'm like, oh, wow, I can understand why my conservative friends will not trust me if I use that as a reference point.
Mhm.
And that's actually something we talk about internally with this new company we're looking at launching in the next 3 or 4 months, is that we actually want to be the source when people are debating each other. It's like, where did you get this? Oh, I got that from so-and-so's company. Oh, all right, shit. There's like, that's a good source.
Yeah.
And they'll like it because they won't like everything we report on. If you're, good, solid Democrat, you're not going to like our reporting on harm reduction as an example, or you're not like it on gender ideology or defund the police or whatever else we're reporting on. And if you're on the conservative side, you may not like it either. But the idea behind that is that, hey, this is just what the evidence led us to. This is the story. It's not a narrative. It's not an ideology. It's what took place. And that's something we believe we can do. We have to prove it. And as I've said to the team internally, is that we actually can't say this in our copy because it sounds really awful. That we're going to do it. It's like, no, you can't tell anyone what you're doing. You have to show what you're doing.
Well, it's like Tony used to say, you can't say that you're humble because then you're probably not humble. Yeah.
Right. I'm the most humblest man on earth, which was an old Moses statement from, No, that's exactly what it is you have to actually be able to do the work and show the work. And from that, then you'll get your membership and your subscribers, because we believe my most loyal subscribers get mad at me once in a while, but they're nice about it. They'll say, I don't know if you could do some more homework on this. And I'm like, cool. And then the people that my biggest detractors, I've had a couple of them, she just kept coming on. She was a trans woman and she's from Britain. And every time I posted something, she just hammered me. And people are like, why don't you remove this woman? I'm like, because I don't remove people. She wasn't mean-spirited or lying or calling me names. She was just saying, I think you're doing this wrong, and I think you need to interview more people. It seems like everyone you interview identifies this way, and I think and I was like, all right, that's fair. Why don't you come on the show?
Yeah.
That's what I said to her. Why don't you come on the show and just let's talk it through,
Did she?
No. The neat thing about that, by the way, is I've invited probably 20 people on the show who come at me pretty hard.
Yep, they won't.
I had one person call me a douchebag because you're just a typical douchebag. And I laughed and I said, I'm not a douchebag. I'm the douchebag. And then I sent him a link to my memoir. Yeah. And he sends me back a note. He's like, oh my God, I'm a new subscriber. That's the greatest retort ever. He didn't read my book, obviously.
Perfect comeback.
Yeah, because I was like, dude, I know I have flaws and I make mistakes and, I'm going to do things wrong, but I'll report it and I'll correct it.
And sometimes there's not right and wrong. It's just an opinion, or maybe.
Well, that's what op-eds are about.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think op-ed's a good op-ed. You have to, it's what it is.
Yeah.
But it's not fact. It's not who it is. And we did a lot of op-eds. I wrote a piece called I liked Hillbilly Vance better. It was about, Vance was his name, J.D. Vance.
Oh, yeah.
Senator in Ohio. And I read his memoir in 2016.
You did?
It was called Hillbilly Elegy. It was a fantastic book. It actually was part of the reason I wrote my own. And JD grew up in this less than optimal situation, the Appalachians, poor, white. And it was a great book. And it kind of explained the plight of this, this impoverished group of white people across the Appalachian Valley. And it was a bestseller. And he went to Ohio State undergrad, went into the Marine Corps first, straightened himself out, then went to Ohio State, then went to Yale Law School, graduated top of his class, became a very powerful VC here in San Francisco with Peter Thiel. He's a very impressive young man. I really liked him. And I thought that he would be a wonderful Reagan Republican, small c conservative, because that's kind of how he represented himself through his book and through his very polished career here in the Valley. And then soon, fast forward, he was saying that Donald Trump, at the time, he was saying Donald Trump was a cancer analogous to fentanyl running through his community.
Which he said that?
Right. Said that. And
I thought he liked Trump.
Oh, no. Well, then he ran for Senate in 2022, I think it was.
Yep.
And he won. And to do that, he actually had to
kiss the ring.
Give up. Yeah, he had to kiss the ring. And so he said, I think Mr. President was and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, Mr. President was my favorite president in my lifetime.
Oh, come on. See that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
so that's
Well,
kind
he
of
won, and he won, and he won, and he won, and
oh,
that's the issue right now around our
that's a
politics. Is that,
huge issue. And
yeah,
that's something I wrote down. I wrote the words pandering, authenticity, respect, doing what's right, doing things for votes. And I always say pandering is expensive. And, it depends on the
yeah,
topic or whatever the issue is at hand. But that's the issue, is that people are doing this to get elected and you
yeah.
don't know
You
what's what.
you have to, and that's kind of what we saw. I don't know if you saw, the recent uh the midterms, well, actually not the midterms, but the Republican convention here, where
Yeah.
Haley in New Hampshire and Tim Scott
Yep.
backed
Trump.
Mr. Trump.
Yep.
And I read Tim Scott's memoir, and I've always kind of supported him as a small C conservative. He seems like a really nice man. He seems principled. His grandparents were actual sharecroppers, so it's like, all right, you are an example of how good America can be.
Yeah.
Right? So in 2 generations, you're now a United States senator, and good for you. And like I said, he seems like a really good guy. And then on camera, Mr. Trump baits him with, hey, you must really hate Haley,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
To endorse me. And then he takes his time to walk around the podium and even surprise Mr. Trump by walking up to him, because Trump
facing him. Yeah.
It says, I don't hate her, I just love you.
Yep.
And I almost threw up. I was like, oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. Like, it was so bad. It was just like, that level of pandering, to use your word, was just nauseating. And you have to do it in the Republican Party today. You just have to.
Well, I think they have to do it. And yes, to get where they are, they had to do it to get there. But people are sick of it, I think.
Well, I think that we talked about this earlier. 8% minoritarian based on the left, 8% minoritarian based on the right. Then there's the rest of us in the middle.
Yeah.
We're sick of it. But if you look at the primary elections are dictated by these minoritarian bases. And that's another problem with our body politics.
It's a huge problem.
So if you look at if you win the primary, you pretty much win the general in almost every congressional race.
Yeah.
Because of gerrymandering and what's going on with our politics. And then if you don't kiss the ring of Mr. Trump, you end up like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and anyone else who pushed back. I think it was every single Republican who voted to impeach is gone.
Yeah.
Right?
It's unfortunate.
So you can't win against Trump. And that's another thing too, that if you look at just the politics in general, is it broken? Yeah, it's broken because
Big
the
time.
questions. Mr. Trump was found liable of sexually assaulting E. Jean Carroll.
Yep.
In a court of law. And every time, reporters ask Republicans about one of Trump's, disastrous comments or behaviors, they'll say things like, I didn't pay attention to that, or I haven't read up on that, or I don't understand that. But they asked Tim Scott, what'd you think of this? And he said, well, I think that, the people that are voting for Donald Trump worry about their inflation and what they're paying for milk and eggs and things. So it's just a complete deflection. And then when they say, well, I haven't really paid attention to it. And Lee Stefanik said something to the effect of, that's not what we care about, or I don't really care what media says.
Yeah. I remember.
And the reporter could have said something to the effect of, it's not the media. This was a court of law. This was a jury,
right,
of her peers who awarded her a defamation win and a sexual assault win and a $5 million judgment. Then Mr. Trump doubled down, and she sued him again.
Yeah, he was defying the judge in front of the judge.
Well, right. And then they went to, and so then he gets an $83 million judgment against him, which then people on the right are saying, well, that's crazy, and it's completely over. You're like, yeah, it is crazy. But you know what punitive damages are?
Yeah.
Punitive damages are an actual award for outrageous behavior.
For punishment. Yeah.
Because he won't shut up.
Shut the fuck up.
He continues to defame her, right?
Exactly.
Like, well, why are we even arguing about this? This is a man who was actually found liable of sexual assault and defamation in a court of law. And we don't even have a problem with that as a culture anymore.
Yeah, right.
So like back when they tried to get him in the race, and I remember this too, it was all of his handlers were panicked about his DUI. Yeah. Like, I don't know if we can get past that, man. I don't know if we can get past that. It's like, it's a fucking DUI, right? It's bad, but it's not like, oh, okay, I don't know if I can ever have the president. We now have a president running who's going to be the actual nominee for the GOP.
Yep.
Who was found libel of sexual assault.
Right? How many
And
indictments?
no one cares.
Nobody
And
cares.
all the other stuff is like, that's still in court. So innocent until proven guilty, fine. We'll shut the fuck up. But that is done. It's done. And no one cares.
They don't.
That just tells you where we... No, they don't care. Like, well, you know, people care more about their groceries. Like no, dude, like that was... He is a... Yeah, he's just not a good human being. We shouldn't have him.
Oh, it's bad. And I went to the Trump rally in New Hampshire. Did I tell you?
Yes.
So
you didn't tell me about it.
Oh, so
I
went.
Talked to you since.
Yeah. So I went. My friend Brett, he was also a selectman in a neighboring town, Dighton. And so we're both not in office right now. And so he's like, Holly, let's go to the rally. I'm like, are you kidding me? He's like, yeah, let's go. We can interview people. And we ended up interviewing a couple afterwards at the bar. But yeah, we went up there and we went there early. And the speeches, Rudy Giuliani was there. He didn't speak. There were several speeches at the beginning. And then there was a gap with some music and while people filed in. And then Trump came on and he spoke for a long time. I think it was at least 90 minutes. It was so painful. It was so painful.
How big was the turnout?
So this is funny. So that's the same arena I went to for a graduation, for my cousin's graduation. And when I went for my cousin's graduation, it was packed. The whole thing was full. It was enormous. But when I got there, I'm like, it looks so small. Well, it's small because they had a black curtain to cut it in half. And the black curtain was behind the stage. So then there was a stage and it was like a horseshoe. And I was at the other end of the horseshoe. I was actually sitting with the press, with Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post, which was awesome. But anyway, so he got up and he said, oh, we're breaking all sorts of records here with the attendance. And I'm like, I was just fucking here. You're not breaking any records. It's so obvious. And people ate it up. And it was pretty tame. It was good. Like people were behaved. But at one point, the guys behind me, they were younger guys. They just sounded like the way they were yelling was very like pounding their chest, Neanderthal style, like, yeah, Biden sucks. And like they said nothing of substance. They just kept yelling louder and louder. And for a minute, I started to think about January 6th. And I just got a little nervous because I'm in a wheelchair because of my injury. And I'm like, if I have to get out of here, I'm kind of screwed.
Yeah.
So I got a little nervous because I'm like trying to plan if something did happen, if I'd have to like scoot out with Brett, and it ended up being fine. And I turned around and tried to make friends with them, and it was fine. But I'm like, oh God, I hope they don't figure out that we just don't support Donald Trump, because Karen, the reporter in front of us, we were chatting for a long time. And we didn't say anything either way, but she's like, oh, why are you guys here? And we talked about the podcast I'm doing, and she said, oh, what's it about? So we told her the salt grain and this and that. She said, oh, what? So she wrote it down, and we said, yeah, we're actually like, we're not really Trump supporters, but we really want to be here and see what it's all about. And she goes, you know what? I knew you had an ironic look. So like she knew, she just had a vibe and she knew, but that made me a little nervous because I'm like, well, if other people see that we're not supporting him, like, are they going to do something? Like, I don't know. I just got a little nervous, but it was fine.
Well, I mean, it's the thing too with when I go to anything to do with Republicans, any type of event like that, it's the neat thing for me is that most of my relatives and most of my friends from high school are Trump fans.
Yeah.
And we still get along famously. They rip on me and they call me their favorite libtard, but these are my best friends. And I was just home visiting my mom in Minnesota over the holiday, and my mom, tells people my son's a reporter and this is what he's doing now, and it's basically the first job she's ever understood, because in media she didn't even know what I did. So, I think he does something with computers. But so when I interviewed my mom's friends, we'd have dinner, lunch, coffee, whatever it was, and they'd ask me about Trump. Like, what do you think of him? Like, I don't think he's a really good person. Let me just say that. But I don't dislike anyone that likes Trump. I don't think that people that vote for Trump are racist as a group. I
have very good friends that are huge. Yeah.
And so and then it calms them down, because then they know that I live in San Francisco. They know that I'm a liberal, and I'm always like, Bob, one of my mom's friends. I'm like, I've known you for 50 years. You're a good man. And if you think Trump is your choice, that's cool. Like, vote for him. And he's like, well, you don't like him because he's he says what he. And I said, no, I don't like him because he's a criminal.
Yeah.
I said, so there's just that. I said,
and a liar.
but
Yeah.
and then I worked in New York City for a decade. I know what his reputation was like as a businessman. I know people that worked for him. I don't like him. But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean I don't like you, sir. I'd make
Yeah.
sure he understood that. And I think that's where I think our politics has gotten so cancerous, because we shouldn't hate the other person just based on whether they vote Team Blue or Team Red, because there's reasons for it.
Right.
I mean, many of the conversations I've had, we did a thing. I interviewed a couple of really cool stalwarts from K Street, some guys in Washington, D.C., about how the Democrats have lost the working class
Mm-hmm.
and how bad the Democrats are at messaging.
Yes.
So it's like those two pieces were like, oh, that's interesting. And as we started to dive into it, we lost the Democrats pretty much after the 80s.
Yeah.
60s, 70s. If you look at like after World War II, the Democrats did a really good job of embracing labor unions and embracing the working man. And, after Reagan, we really didn't. And we still haven't. Specifically the last 20 years, we've almost forgotten the working man. And that's what Donald Trump does a very good job.
He does.
Of doing. He reaches out to this group who feels disenfranchised, who feels like, hey, no one's paying attention to me.
Yeah.
And then, as you and I've talked about off camera, the Democratic Party now has a very loud minority voice that believes that capitalism is bad.
Yep.
That all white people are racists, and that gender ideology is something that should be taught to 8-year-olds, right? So, and then again, it's a very small minority within the Democratic Party, but it's a very loud voice.
Yes.
And so you're losing Democrats. And I don't mean just white, uneducated Democrats, which has typically been the issue. We're losing Black voters. We're losing Hispanic voters. We're losing Asian voters across the board. I'm married to a Chinese woman. I've been in part of that culture for 16 years of my life. And they, as a group, are not fond of these notions. Specifically, the immigrants who come here don't think America's a bad place. They don't think America's inherently racist. They don't think it's that all white people are racist. There's all of these things now that the Democrats are touting that are at an optics level hurting the party specific to unity.
Yes.
And so if you look at the unity necessary for any party to win, we've made some really big progress specific to the overreach of the Republican parties on abortion, as an example. And I think it's one of the only reasons we have a chance of winning in 2024 is because the continued overreach of the Republican Party specific to women's autonomy around abortion. And those are the kind of things where I don't, we, as we talk about this in our company all the time, is like, what's the remedy? What is it? What can Democrats do better to reconnect with these voters? And that's something that no one wants to point to and say, well, Donald Trump at least asks them their opinion. He at least tells them he cares. We don't care as a group about mostly the working class. If you look at, the demographics of most of these people I'm mentioning, they are upper middle class, white, and liberal. And that's a very difficult, that's a very bifurcated demographic, because all my friends growing up, specifically my friends who are artisans, electricians, carpenters, construction workers, middle managers, whatever they may be, they feel left out by the Democratic Party.
Well, I think there's other pieces to it too. I think that Trump has always been like a marketing business guru, and he knows whether he means what he's saying or not, he knows how to get to the audience that he needs to get to. He's done that his whole career. He knows how to market himself. I mean, you know better than I do about marketing, but that's just what I see. And he knows how to drum up the support and get people excited. And branding, talk about branding. I mean, his followers are, in my opinion, obsessed with his brand, and they identify with it, which I understand. I understand what they identify with. I understand why. But a lot of them become so obsessed with it where it becomes their identity, and they refuse to listen to anything else. And so I feel like, back to pandering, I feel like if everyone in the Republican Party would stop the bullshit and be more honest and stop the pandering, I think it would just be a better place. and it would be a better party, and everyone would be better off for it. But they're not all going to stop at once, and that's the difficult part. Like, good for Liz Cheney, good for Adam Kinzinger for speaking up. I applaud them big time. I respect them so much. And that was a hard thing for them to do, but they were raw, honest people, and they're still talking about it. So, and even in my small town, it kind of goes back to you being attacked by both sides. I think that shows that you're doing something right. Even in my small town, it's similar to what you're doing in your podcast. When I was in office, I was just, look, I'm an engineer. Like, I'm not here. I would actually say in meetings, if people were in the meeting yelling at me, like not agreeing with whatever I was saying, which actually happened,
Yeah.
I would yell back and say, look, this is not the time. I'm not here to get votes from you. If you don't like what I'm saying, don't vote for me. I don't want your vote. I'm here to do what's right. And people hated me for that, but people loved me for it too. So, and there was 5 years of that. And towards the end of the 5 years, it became so contentious that people would take it personally. And, the whole power plant thing, it became personal to them because in a similar way to Trump, they were identifying with whatever they were fighting for, which what they were fighting for, in my opinion, if you look at all the facts, it was mostly fabricated. But they knew, like, they just identified with it, and they said, oh, this was my identity. Like, I've never had this feeling before. I've never been elected before. I've never been paid attention to before. I don't have a college degree. I've never been involved in town, and now I'm involved, and people are listening to me because I'm loud and nasty, and people listen to them for a long time. And that's part of why I resigned, because I'm like, this is helpless.
But it's very tough. And I think
Yeah.
what you're pointing to, which is really powerful, is identity politics in general is powerful because, and this is not a conversation most people want to have, it's more difficult to change your spots politically than anything else.
Yes.
So if there was a scholar, it was on Glenn Loury's podcast, and Glenn Loury is a professor at Columbia, and he has a podcast called The Glenn Show. And the name of the professor escapes me, but he talks specifically about how he was once conservative and then started to become more liberal. And actually, no, it was the opposite. He was liberal and became more conservative. And as he started to change, he lost his friendships, he lost his wife, he lost his job.
Oh my God.
The worst. Well, and this does happen. So if you look at, and I've said this to anyone that will listen, if all your best friends are wearing Trump hats and believe that Donald Trump is the man and a good president
and the savior,
like his policies,
yeah,
well, yeah, and then you decide, well, he's not a good person, I don't want to be affiliated with him, and I don't think that's a difficult thing for you on your friendships.
Yeah,
your wife could be a big supporter. So it's really difficult for people to change their spots on anyone, specifically as someone who is as charismatic as Mr. Trump, right?
Yeah.
He has charisma, whether people want to admit it or not.
He does.
I'm not a fan, obviously. I've said that already. But
yeah,
the fact is, he's a very charismatic. He's funny. He's a marketing genius. This is another thing no one wants to talk about, but he is.
Yeah.
He actually workshops.
See, that means more coming from you. Yeah.
Well, he workshops his stuff. So if you watch some of his like older, town halls, you'll see how he kind of tests things to see how they work. And he's like a comedian that way. He's like, that was a good one. That one, they love that one. They love that one. But he's taking mental notes. Oh, it's like, let's put on a Muslim band. And when he first did that, it was kind of like, it didn't work. But then he went to a different room, at a different presentation, and they loved it. And he's like, hey, that worked out okay. So let's try it again. And then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And he does that with everything. He does that with nicknames.
Yes.
Right? If you look at the nicknames, little Marco Rubio, right? Little LID.
Ron DeSanctimonious.
Ron DeSanctimonious, Meatball Ron, right? It was like
Bird brain.
I mean, he's really good at that because
it's bad, but he's
good at being mean-spirited. He knows, he kind of figures out what bothers you. I can tell this is going to be insecure for you, and I'm going to poke it. And that's what he's good at. And so you're like, oh, okay, well, he's good at that level of marketing and branding and talking about himself. And, there's the room around the campfire with most of our friends in the business, in my industry, is that Mark Burnett is the person most responsible for Donald Trump ever winning the presidency. Because without him, he was the producer of The Apprentice.
Oh,
And
okay.
without The Apprentice, Donald wouldn't have been known by anyone outside of New York
Yeah.
City.
I liked him on
And
The Apprentice. I love when he
well, we
fired
all
people.
did. We all
Yeah.
like, I
Yeah.
didn't watch it, but I kind of like anyone who also worked in New York City. I got a kick out of him. I thought he was just a harmless buffoon.
Just a
Right?
hard ass. Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't. Well, because he's just typical of, the king's idiot son. His father was a wonderful, well, he was a wonderful businessman, but he was a ruthless, draconian prick who turns out to be a racist.
Yep.
But Fred built the empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Fred handed $500 million to his idiot son when he died. That's the only reason he had any money. And then he also made 400+ million off of royalties from The Apprentice. So that's how he paid off most of his bills for everything he started on his own that failed. And so it's one of those things where you're like, all right, well, what is he good at? Why do we even celebrate this man? Well, he's good at certain things.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
He's good at optics. He's good at branding. He's good at marketing. He's good at selling himself as a self-made, because he always talks about, I borrowed $1 million from my dad and everything else was mine. You're like, all right.
Yeah.
If people are going to believe that, there's nothing you can do to change their views.
Right.
So,
and I think now more than ever, it's harder, like you were saying, to change your political view because Trump, especially when you go from Trump to not Trump or non-Trump to Trump, because Trump is such an aggressive, obnoxious, like way over the top identity. Yeah. Once you identify with it, it seems to just take over everything. It's just overbearing. So I think it's hard once people own that. Like I said before, they identify with it, and it's like something. It's like letting go a piece of themselves, and say that they don't want to. They feel like it's part of them almost, and that's scary.
Yeah, and you also see that in the new congressional representatives. So
yes,
look at people like Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz and Mo Brooks. They're much more vitriolic. They're much more cantankerous. They like the spotlight. We from the industry, the ad industry, we always talked about influencers and how important they were for your brand.
Mm-hmm.
Like Michael Jordan probably being the biggest example of that. Today, our congressional representatives, a pretty large majority of them are influencers. They're not actually legislators anymore. They're not attempting to get bills passed. We're not doing a lot of
not getting anything passed
to get things done. But they get their soundbite.
Yeah.
They get their their mention on YouTube or TikTok or Twitter. Their individual brand rises. So if you look at MTG as an example, the reason she's so powerful and the reason that she goes after these sound bites is that she raises money on each and every one of them. And because she raises money, she has more money to help additional new candidates in the RNC, and she can donate her money to them. So if you want MTG support and you want the RNC support, you need to be this kind of a person.
Yeah.
And if you look at the differences between, old school Republicans like Mitt Romney and John McCain and Jeff Flake and like all these, stoic, I think, small c conservative Republicans who I look up to and I think are good men, versus what we see today, right? That's a big difference.
Huge difference.
It's a really big difference between a group of politicians that actually wanted to work together on the Beltway, even though they had these fundamental differences, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, those kind of things were used to be the topics. Now is if we can't help you. If I'm on the GOP, I can't actually extend the olive branch. I can't actually vote with you on your policy, even if it's in the best interest of my own constituents in my own congressional district. Because if I'm seen partying with you I'm done. I'm primary.
Yeah, you lose money, you lose support.
You're out.
Yeah. And that's scary. And I think that ties back to social media because everything has changed. Everything has changed. I think when I first ran for office was when Trump was running for office. And when I got my head out of the clouds after my election was done, I was like, oh shit, there's an actual national election happening right now. I better pay attention. And I started to really pay attention because I had just finished my own campaign. And I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. I've never quite paid attention to a presidential election this way. And it was kind of stressful because I felt like I was reliving my campaign. But you can see like how social media impacts the spread of misinformation, the branding, the identity,
For sure.
And you see that with all the folks you just mentioned, Lauren Boebert, MTG, and they feed off of that. And it's just, even on the small scale, it's like when you're a kid on the playground and there's a bully, all the kids want to be friends with the bully. And I feel like that's what's happening. Like they're trying to get in good graces with the big bully because, oh, look, he's popular. He controls people. He does things and he's strong and intimidating. And I want to be his friend. But if everyone would stand up to the bully, like we'd all be better for it. But it's just a matter of getting there. And it's so hard to get there. And that's why for so long, for so many years, I stood against the bully alone because no one else wanted to stick their neck out and help me because it's scary.
No.
And
it is.
And so for a while, like people were like, oh, it's just Holly, because I was by myself. So people were like, oh, all these other people can't be wrong, even though they're assholes and they're loud and they're maybe lying. But we want to be friends with them because they're seemingly having more influence right now. And that's what took place. Luckily, now things have changed and people are finally seeing it. But it took a lot of unraveling for people to realize, like, oh, God, she was right.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to happen with the next 10 months. If you look at the election itself,
I hope so.
People don't really pay attention to. I mean, if we held the election today, I think Donald Trump could win.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of debate around that. But anyone who says they know who's going to win this election this far out, I think it's just fooling themselves or trying to plant a flag that will probably get blown over.
Yeah.
Because it's really difficult to say, what could happen. Either one of these older men in Biden and Trump could have a serious health issue, which could change the trajectory. Donald Trump's legal woes are just beginning.
Right.
And so, there's another one coming down by the end of this month, his civil fraud trial, which could be anywhere between $200 and $350 million in damages. If that's the case, he just had to put up a bond for this $83 million.
Yep.
Best case scenario is 20% fee on $83 million. He put up the $5 million originally. Because I have a lot of my friends who are saying he won't pay. He won't pay. He's Trump. He doesn't have to pay. I'm like, well, see, there's one thing about the court of public opinion, and Trump wins there, but then the court of law, it's a whole different thing. They don't say, oh, you can pay if you want to, Mr. Trump. It's like, no, we're going to take this from you.
Yeah.
And so you either give us the money or we come after it.
Yeah, liquidate it. Yeah.
And he can do this during appeal. He can just put a bond up if anyone wants to give him the money. It's another thing that people have to figure out.
Yep.
And if he does lose the civil fraud trial, he will then also have that monies that will have to be put aside. And so you're looking at some real dollars now, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, no matter how rich you are as a billionaire, how much liquid cash you have. He bragged about having $400 million a year ago during his deposition.
Yeah, is it real?
Some of that has been, and who knows, because you can't really believe what he says. You have to kind of look at what he's doing. But $400 million of liquid cash isn't something anyone carries. I don't care how rich you are.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where that could affect him. If he loses his business license in New York, which is another possibility of the trial, then he's got Jack Smith and the election fraud.
January 6th.
That's going to be an issue. It's going to be public. So you're going to see the trial. You're going to hear the testimony.
Oh, right.
So it's going to be a very different thing as far as optics. And there's, tons of polls out there, Gallup and others, that say that if Donald Trump is actually convicted of a felony, that it's a 15% move, and that 45% of actual Republicans now believe that he's no longer viable as a candidate. So you're looking at different statistics. Maybe I got that last one wrong, but it is about a 10 or 15% swing. But Donald Trump can't take a 10 or 15% swing.
No,
because
can't.
His voters right now, his base is that the 30 to 40 million that will vote for him no matter what he does. And then the others are kind of in the sense of, I don't like the Democrats because they're scary, so I'll just continue to vote for him. But then if he gets convicted of a felony or he gets convicted of all these other civil trials, and now he's, there's these things that could make him look weaker than he wants to look. And I think that those are things that could change the landscape of this election in 2024, but I sure have no idea what's going to happen.
I am not even going to think. I'm not even going to try to guess. Yeah. One last thing I want to talk about, and it kind of ties everything together, but when we talk about Tony Hsieh, we talk about politics and all of these things. We talk about your podcast and being attacked from both sides and staying true, and the name is in your podcast, True 30.
Yeah.
And So I think what's important, I always think back to Tony, and I learned so much from Tony, and I kind of mentioned this in your podcast when we talked last time, is that, when you stay true to your values, your core values, you can't really go wrong. You're going to have some hard times, like you're being attacked, but eventually it will balance out. Like for me, I was attacked for a couple years and it was really, really hard. I could have taken the easy way out and just pandered to everyone and told them what they wanted to hear, but I stayed true to my core values. And now I'm finally on the other side of it and I'm very proud of that. And it's a lot harder to do, but I think if everyone stays true and we can somehow get rid of these and stop everyone from pandering and the bullshit, then we're just going to be in a better place. And it goes back to adapting. We have to deal with social media now where it's not going anywhere. So if everyone could just get on board eventually with just being real and stop the nonsense. And we talk about defunding the police. Just a quick anecdote. When I was in office, that was a big thing in Massachusetts. It had just come up. And they were pushing through very, very, very quickly. I think it's the 2800, the bill 2800. I don't remember the exact name of it, but they were restructuring everything to do with police in Massachusetts, and they formed what's called the Post Commission. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but they look at all the police records, and their personnel files are now public record, and they review all the chiefs and all the police to see if there's any record of aggression and things like that. And they can decertify police officers if they feel that if they have a bad record. Well, back then, my senator, who is amazing, I get along great with him. He's an incredible man. But the Senate was pushing this bill through with the help of the president of the Senate. And understandable, but the police officers in my town were reaching out to me as a selectman saying, Holly, can you help us? Like, they felt helpless because no one had approached the chief. No one had approached the police officers in my town or anywhere. None of the other chiefs were approached. It was that fast. And they didn't sit down with them to say, like, okay, what do you think about this? Let's kind of iron things out. So they were like, oh my God, what are we going to be forced to do? I don't know where we're going to go with this. Like, are we going to lose our jobs? What's our job going to be like? The body cams, everything. How are we going to act? We're under a microscope. And so they reached out to me and said, is there any way you can find a way to support us? I said, well, I do support you. I genuinely support you because I am a huge advocate of talking through things with the right people before you act. And that, in my opinion, hadn't happened. So I made a public statement saying, I understand BLM. I understand this movement and things need to change because of what's happened nationally. But let's not cut our nose off to spite our face. And let's respect the people that we have there. And they're worried, rightfully so. So I made this statement and it pissed off my senator. He was really upset with me, which I understand. I'm like, look, Senator, I know I didn't call you first, but I had to do something fast because they work for me and I do genuinely support them. So like that was hard, and I took it from both sides.
Oh, I bet.
So, it's just hard navigating right now with the way things are going and the speed at which they're going and social media in the mix. And I don't know, I'm really excited for your podcast and the direction it's going in. And we just need more of that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We're looking forward to doing what we think is, as again, reporting on the whole story. That's really the issue. And being able to suck that up, because we obviously are going to get taken it on both sides of the equation, but we're okay with that. And I think that's the neat thing about real journalism is that you have to be agnostic to the outcome.
And you're earning people's trust. Like, even though you're getting attacked, you're slowly earning the trust. Like you said, the coconut tree, and you're building and building and building. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah, we have patience for that. It's one of those things where, as media folks and political folks that we're now getting together and starting this company together, we know that we have to have patience with it. That's the one thing we've all agreed on. I just had a call with this team this morning, and we have to be patient We know it's going to take us a couple of years just to break even. We know it's going to take us about 5 years to build a brand. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It can't be anything quicker. There will be some viral moments, where you have a really cool story or a cool interview that may go viral, but that's, as you know, you don't manufacture virality. It happens on its own.
Right.
And so there will be stories and things that do take place that will elevate our brand. And then that's where we have to be even more consistent to our values and our mission of just being agnostic to the outcome of our stories. And that's the goal.
I love it. And I guess that's why I'm doing this for free now, thankfully, because I don't know what would happen if I was paid. I may get attacked more.
Yes, you probably would.
Yeah, but eventually that might hopefully happen. So, I can monetize it somehow, but.
Yes, that's exactly. Well, I appreciate you bringing me on. It was really nice talking.
Thank you so much, Joey. It's been awesome talking to you, and I'm so glad we're still in touch.
Me too.
And good luck with everything, and we'll chat soon.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joey.
Bye.
Bye. The Salt Green is a podcast where politicians stop pandering and start getting real. This podcast is me, Holly McNamara, various co-hosts and guests. Our post-production is done by Pixella Films. For more content and all social media links, you can find us on thesaltgrain.com. Thank you for joining us while we take you into our world of public service, and be sure, as always, to take everything with a grain of salt.